So what kind of avoidant are you dealing with? Is your partner or your ex, are they a dismissive avoidant or a fearful avoidant? What's the differences? Well, let's start with dismissive avoidance. Dismissive avoidants are the pure avoidants. They're the purebreds. They are all avoidant. This is a person whose core wound is defectiveness, feeling like there's something wrong with them, that they are unlovable and defective at their core. They tend to be completely emotionally unavailable. Now, in childhood, they received profound, consistent childhood emotional neglect. Their emotional needs were not met at all, growing up in households where you don't talk about feelings, and their own feelings brutally rejected. Oh, you're crying? I'll give you something to cry about. Now, dismissive avoidance often had a narcissistic parent that was very critical, very controlling, not just correcting, but critical. Put them down when they failed to meet expectations. And narcissistic parents tend to be very demanding. And that's because they get their own ego stroked when their child has any kind of success. Look at my kid. Look how great they are. They're amazing because I'm amazing. And because I'm amazing, my child's amazing. So they're very demanding, but they're very dismissive of the child's emotions. And what happens is the child, who grows up to be a dismissive avoidant, learns emotional suppression as a coping mechanism. They learn to stuff their feelings. They learn to squash it down because their feelings, they learn, were not welcome in childhood. Nobody wanted to deal with their emotions. Their emotions are a burden. So they stuff it, and put on a happy face. They also learn to associate being close with anybody with losing your independence, being controlled, being smothered, because that's what their demanding, critical, narcissistic parent did to them. So closeness equals being smothered and controlled and rejected on top of it. Now, they develop this core wound of shame. Shame is a toxic emotion. People often confuse it with guilt, but it's not the same thing. Shame is that emotion that says, I'm defective, I'm not lovable, I'm worthless. Guilt is actually a healthy emotion. If you feel guilty, it means you have a conscience. It's your brain's way of saying, I did something wrong. But guilt has a potential resolution. You can make amends if you hurt somebody, or you can stop repeating whatever behavior you feel guilty about. But shame, on the other hand, the only healthy resolution to shame is to heal the wound. Because guilt is I did something wrong, shame is I am something wrong. And dismissive avoidants are filled with that I am something wrong wound. This is why emotional closeness feels so deeply unsafe to their nervous system. Because of that shame. Their fear is if I lower my walls and I let my partner in, my partner's going to figure me out. They're going to figure out that I'm defective, that I'm not lovable, and they're going to reject me. But they're also going to smother, control me, and I'm going to lose my independence and then get rejected. So closeness feels deeply unsafe to their nervous system. Danger, danger, danger. That's what it alerts when things get close. But the thing is, due to this shame, dismissive avoidants struggle to self-reflect. They really struggle to look at themselves. And because of this, many dismissive avoidants experience arrested development. They're stuck in a childlike emotional age, usually 8, 9, 10 years old, somewhere around there. Because looking at themselves, taking accountability was unsafe. So they learn to do the mental gymnastics to make everything they do somebody else's fault or something else's fault. Because if it's not their fault, they don't have to self-reflect, which means they don't have to face that shame. To dismissive avoidance, taking accountability is so painful because even the slightest bit of accountability is the emotional equivalent of confirming their own defectiveness. See, I did this wrong because I'm defective. I did this wrong. I hurt this person is proof that I am worthless. So in order to avoid that accountability, especially in a romantic relationship, they are very prone to doing things like gaslighting, trying to get their partner to doubt their feelings. See, it's not that I'm not giving enough. It's that you're too needy or you're just imagining things. And getting their partner to doubt themselves helps them escape that accountability, which means they don't have to face their shame. So dismissive avoidance early in a relationship, they are very prone to love bombing. Not all of them do, but they really are. And that's because early in the relationship, it's the shared fantasy. All these suppressed and bottled up emotions aren't being so suppressed because there's no actual emotional intimacy. There's no threat of vulnerability. It's safe early on, and they're riding that dopamine wave, dopamine being that reward hormone. And they're letting all these bottled up emotions flow out onto you. Now, dismissive avoidance, once they get to that 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 month mark, the dopamine levels tend to crash. And dismissive avoidance Well, they really struggle to oxytocin bond to their partners. Oxytocin is the bonding hormone. Now, you are getting flooded with oxytocin during this early honeymoon phase with them, but they are not with you because due to that profound neglect, they really were never exposed to oxytocin in a healthy way. So dopamine comes down. For a healthier, more emotionally available person, oxytocin is there to take over. For the dismissive avoidant, there's really nothing left but their insecurities around intimacy, conflict, expectations, and things along those lines. So they start to withdraw from the relationship to create emotional distance to protect themselves, because emotional distance feels safe to them. Nobody can reject them if you're at an emotional arm's length. And this is where they will assert that independence, because they develop that wound of hyper-independence because they were smothered and controlled as a child. And because they were neglected, they learned very quickly in a young age that the only person that will ever look out for them is them. The only person that will ever meet their needs, well, is themselves. So they develop this hyper-independence. But a more secure person should be an independent person as well. But the dismissive avoidant, because of their insecurities, they make a big deal about their independence. So that's a sign that you're dealing with a DA, is when they really make a big to-do about how independent they are. Now, fearful avoidance, on the other hand. Fearful avoidance, they have what's called disorganized attachment. They actually have both an anxious, preoccupied attachment style as well as a dismissive avoidant attachment style. And their core wound is different. Their core wound is betrayal with a secondary wound of abandonment. Now, this fearful avoidance, they did experience a degree of emotional neglect in childhood, but in addition to that neglect, they often experienced very chaotic environments, volatile environments, and sometimes even outright abuse and trauma. Not all the times, but many, many times. So, due to the inconsistencies in their childhood, along with the neglect, they actually develop both an anxious attachment as well as a dismissive avoidant attachment. And not all fearful avoidants are the same. Some lean heavily anxious. They have both insecure attachment styles, but they might lean more anxious and some might lean more avoidant. And the way that the anxious fearful avoidants show up in a relationship is vastly different than the way that dismissive fearful avoidants show up in a relationship. Dismissive fearful avoidance can be the most difficult type of avoidant, the most difficult insecure attacher to figure out. Anxious leaning fearful avoidants have a pretty good chance and success of becoming emotionally available, working on themselves, and growing because of that anxious side being more dominant, the anxious side being more willing to look at themselves, to self-reflect, learn, and grow. And many of them do turn into great partners. Now, the core wound, betrayal. Because in some way, shape, or form, in childhood, the fearful avoidant had a parent or caretaker that betrayed their trust. They were supposed to protect them. They were supposed to be there for them, but they didn't. They betrayed their trust and hurt them. So what the fearful avoidant learns at a young age is that love equals pain. Anybody that you rely on, anybody that's supposed to love you is going to hurt you. And then potentially even abandon you, because that's what the anxious side says. Anxious attachment is formed when emotional needs are met sometimes and then taken away. So they experience that too. When their needs are being met, it's that fear, my needs are going to be taken away. So betrayal and abandonment for fearful avoidance, those are the core wounds. For dismissive avoidant, it is defectiveness. Now, fearful avoidance in relationships, they can really vary how they show up. A more anxious-leaning fearful avoidant will seem like an anxious attacher throughout most of the relationship. But they tend to really become hypervigilant. Now, dismissive fearfuls can do this too, but they communicate it less. Hypervigilant, looking for any inconsistencies in their partner, sometimes real or sometimes manufactured. Because if they find the inconsistency in their partner, you said you did this, but you did that, or things along those kind of lines, then it validates the fearful avoidance fear about betrayal. See, I found an inconsistency. It's proof my partner is going to betray me. A more anxious-leaning fearful avoidant will be willing to communicate this and talk about it with their partner and work through it. A more dismissive one will bottle it up until it reaches a breaking point, and that can result in an abrupt discard of their partner. In general, relationships with fearful avoidance do tend to last much longer than their dismissive counterparts. And dismissive avoidance and fearful avoidance will often pair together, and it creates a very painful dynamic. You see, the fearful avoidant is a deep feeler. They have deep emotions and they understand their emotions very well. Dismissive avoidants are shallow feelers. They suppress emotions and they often experience a strong degree of alexithymia. Alexithymia is the inability to recognize and understand their own emotions, and sometimes even the inability to recognize and understand emotions in others. And it comes from that lifetime of emotional suppression. This is why a lot of dismissive avoidants will rely on alcohol to access their emotions. I hear many times, oh, my dismissive avoidant partner only tells me they love me when they're drinking. That's because of that emotional suppression, and they rely on alcohol to bring it out. And drinking is also a method of avoiding that dismissive avoidants are very prone to, because alcohol hits the dopamine receptors and helps them feel good and numbs the shame. So, fearful avoidance, dismissive avoidance often pair up and they feed off of each other's wounds. The fearful avoidant wants to be reassured. They want to be understood. They want their emotions to be validated and understood. The emotions from the fearful avoidant are triggering to the dismissive avoidant. When the fearful avoidant brings up their needs, dismissive avoidant shuts down. And what they're actually doing is they are replaying their childhood dynamics. The fearful avoidant often had their needs and feelings rejected and not met, and they learned that they had to chase love, to try to earn love, that love was breadcrumbs, that love had to be earned. It wasn't necessarily freely given. And dismissive avoidance, well, they don't deal well with emotions, and they often have a very demanding, controlling parent, and the fearful avoidant will represent that, along with the emotional depth that they never experienced, so that draws them in. And it becomes a very painful dynamic with unresolved conflict. And resentment tends to build in this dynamic until it eventually either reaches a breaking point, or one, or especially both partners heal, work to become more secure, and actually learn to resolve conflict and bring things up in a more healthy, responsive way rather than a reactive way. But fearful avoidants really do tend to show up a lot more differently. They tend to communicate their feelings better. They understand their own feelings better. Dismissive avoidants tend to suppress more. They tend to not understand their emotions. They tend to avoid more, escapism, things along those kind of lines. Now, dismissive leaning fearful avoidants, though, they are the most difficult ones because they do behave on the outside more like a dismissive avoidant, but you add in the betrayal wound, and they're hypervigilant in their own minds, but they're just not communicating it to their partner. Because dismissive avoidance and fearful avoidance that lean heavily dismissive are terrified of conflict. They're absolutely terrified of it because conflict means you have to express your feelings, and expressing your feelings equals rejection, so it feels deeply unsafe to their nervous system. This is why many dismissive avoidants will bail out at the first disagreement, because it feels so deeply unsafe to them. What they want is a relationship with no conflict, because conflict is terrifying to them. Fearful avoidants that are not leaning dismissive tend to be the fighters. They tend to be the ones that really will hammer home their needs. They're hypervigilant. They can be more argumentative and really create conflict. But that's because of their own unhealed attachment wounds, wanting to be understood, wanting to be respected, and wanting their feelings to be validated. So I hope this helps. Many fearful avoidants think they're anxious attachers because they've only ever been in relationships with emotionally unavailable people such as narcissists and dismissive avoidants. But more often than not, actually, most clients that come to me that think that they are anxious attachers are actually fearful avoidants that lean anxious. Of course, there are plenty of anxious attachers out there, the true anxious attachers, but the anxious attachers generally grew up with inconsistent love, but without the chaos, without the trauma, without the abuse, things like that. A more stable household. Anxious attachers are more likely to fawn in conflict, whereas fearful avoidants are more likely to fight. And a good question to ask yourself if you are a fearful avoidant or an anxious attacher, by the way, is, have you ever walked away from a conflict? Do you walk away from conflicts? Do you ever shut down? If the answer is yes, you're probably a fearful avoidant. If you have never walked away from a conflict until it was resolved, or that's pretty much what you do all the time, yeah, you're not a fearful avoidant, you're an anxious attacher, because anxious attachers are the ones who absolutely do not like to go to bed mad. Fearful avoidants, when they're in their dismissive side, when there's a conflict, they can absolutely shut down and push their partner away for a while. But That anxious side is definitely present and can be very distinctive from the dismissive avoidant, who is pretty much avoidant all the time.